Hello and welcome to my comments on your Google Hangout 2 for the group by Michael, Jesse, Paulette, and Kacey. First of all, let me tell you that I enjoyed your Hangout. It was really a great discussion. It showed evidence of readings, and there were a lot of them, as well as really good facilitation and interaction between group members. Michael, thank you for facilitating that, and some really good discussion points that you had in your session. So because it was a very long session, so I'm not gonna comment in depth on it, but because you had pretty much exhausted the topics. But I'm going to touch on some points that you discussed in your group discussion. So with respect to evacuations, Jesse, I think, launched the discussion on issues that Littman mentioned and problems with evacuations with certain populations and making sure that pre-planning is in place as it was evidence in Katrina. So you mentioned a lot of really good points on pre-deployment of different resources, such as public transportation, such as particular fuel stations. That certainly was an issue, as you mentioned, during the evacuation from Rita out of Houston, that people did evacuate, but they did not have enough fuel to, and they were ultimately stuck on the road. Paulette mentioned the issue of school buses and the fact that there were no operators for those buses. So a lot of times we think in planning that we have particular resources, but you also have to think about the human resource and those people that are going to be taking care of their families. And, you mentioned nurses, same goes for bus operators, what kind of human infrastructure you have to plan for. Also with evacuations, you mentioned the preparedness for awareness of shelters, where they are, what they offer, and overcoming the public perception of shelters, which is certainly a lot of times a source of fears, and people don't know what they can count on. And as Drabek says, people don't go to shelters. Typically, a very small population will end up in shelters. I think you mentioned some really good points on pet carriers and pet evacuations, and shelters not typically caring for pets. So you had a really good discussion here. You discussed the counterflow and issues with counterflow, such as proper planning for it. And counterflow can only be successful, obviously, if it's activated in phases, and so you do not have the situation where everybody gets on the road at the same time. And during Ike, even though the counterflow didn't happen, but the counties around Houston area planned for how, by the certain zip codes, those evacuations would progress. And that was certainly a lesson learned from the evacuation, or hectic and chaotic evacuation in Rita. Kacey mentioned about the impact of evacuations on other areas that are maybe the third or fourth zone of accepting the evacuees. You mentioned Dallas, Fort Worth struggling for fuel, because obviously when there are shortages in the South, then it affects the infrastructure further into the states. I think that even Michael might have mentioned the issues with gas stations that were specifically opened for law enforcement, and some kind of public perception issues that could cause. And that's very interesting, because certainly in Harvey, perhaps there needs to be a sort of rethinking about how patrolling is done. And you mentioned that, when you have 50 police vehicles that are trying to gas up, do you rethink the way you patrol? Do you rethink about, having perhaps 2 officers per car, or just, have a forethought on how you're going to use your resources wisely for that? You also talked about, different types of pre-screenings in evacuations, for difficulty with doing credentialing, and certainly that was an issue mentioned. I think Jesse mentioned the Secret Service having some type of credentialing for people getting on buses, getting off buses, having the accountability, knowing who brought what. And certainly that was the issue in Rita when we had evacuees and guests from Louisiana here in Houston, and there were concerns on how to implement, what kind of system to implement. I think they started with just regular color-coded bands on hands, and then went into a more sophisticated Secret Service type of credentialing of people in shelters. So some really good discussion points on that. Of course, you discussed the public perception or, attachment to the households and leaving homes behind, and that's being a very traumatic decision for some of the people. Certain populations, like elderly, they are, even if they can evacuate, they might have concerns about leaving their homes behind. So a good public information campaign or risk communication campaign should probably cover some of the facts about, crime typically going down during critical incidents. That's been documented in research, and yet that those public fears about looting, which is not prevalent, persist. Also, you talked about, I think Kacey mentioned about Spike Lee video that you had in our classes and discussions on hospitality, welcoming. Jesse talked about welcoming the evacuees and how community can have really good strategies of having a spontaneous and emergent initiatives, hospitality initiatives for those people that have been displaced, that are already tremendously traumatized. So any roadblock along the way causes high anxiety and hypervigilance, and responders, emergency managers who plan for those reception points as people get off buses or as they are moved to shelters need to be cognizant of the psychological aspect of how big of a trauma it is to leave one's home and go somewhere else where they don't know how long they're going to stay, or what kind of resources they're going to have. And of course, all the issues you mentioned about those that cannot evacuate because they're disabled, because of their mental health, because of transportation issues, and because of some individuals being rather isolated in their communities. So a really good example of that is in Harvey, where the spontaneous action of volunteers through crowdsourced rescue was launched in Houston. The people that, one person that died out of the 36 in Harvey was actually on the same block that was being evacuated by spontaneous volunteers. But of course, those were the people that were not aware how to access that crowdsourced rescue, and perhaps that one person could have been saved. And then you moved your discussion, and that was a really brilliant part of your talk on mandatory recommended evacuations and issues related to the nomenclature, to the perception of what's mandatory and what that entails, and also really good discussion about the laws and enforcement of mandatory evacuations. And so both of your law enforcement officers, Michael and Jesse, had really strong points on the fact that police are not there to force evacuations. They have no powers to arrest people for wanting to stay in their homes. And B, it is not the time in a response phase and life-saving phase to be an enforcer, so to speak. And besides, there are no resources of people going and forcing people for evacuation. So the mandatory issue remains, and also the complexity of the fact that different states have different nomenclature. That always makes me think about that Homeland Security advisory system that existed that was color-coded, and you had a discussion on that earlier in the semester. It does not really specifically say what type of threat in what area, what specific precautions have to be taken. So when you are dealing with mandatory evacuation, they are extreme challenge to law enforcement. And because of another source that you discussed, and law enforcement typically is not the enforcer in those situations. And as you mentioned, in a response phase or acute phase, they are more of the watchman style of policing, which is not aligning very well with, putting handcuffs on people in a moment of extreme stress and anxiety. So then your discussion moved to, what are the good strategies for encouraging the evacuation. And Kacey had some really good points as well on the fact that when people try to hang on to their homes and in the fires that you mentioned, as long as they were suppressing their own home fires, they were fighting for that house. The moment they evacuated, that house was gone. And so there is this conflictual issue of, possible liability and, lawsuits after that. So that's, a big factor of mandatory evacuations as well. You talked about successful strategies having been documented in research to be the knock by official emergency responders who come and make sure that they inform the public about certain conditions in certain areas. Of course, the knock is not always possible. It's, especially with the onset of events that are very fast, perhaps not with approaching hurricanes where you have a lot more time. But in tornado, for example, if you don't have public warnings, the knock on the door is not going to happen. So it's going to be hazard specific and threat specific as well with those. Some interesting facts about who can enforce possibly an agency that is often not talked about very much is public health. Public health can be very helpful in evacuations because they actually could, under certain conditions, have a legal enforcing position if they deem staying would be a threat to the public health, which is, depending on the event, it could be a factor in some kind of health issues, or if you can apply a statute that has to do with public health. But typically law enforcement at the local level does not have that authority. Neither they, as your officers mentioned, they do not want that responsibility. So in a way, the mandatory evacuations do not have teeth, and I think you discussed that very well. And that goes back to the issue of protection versus defense. We talked about the civil defense and civil protection, where civil defense is going to be a little bit more because of a threat, might be a little bit different than the natural hazards, where there is more of that civil protection aspect to it. Paulette mentioned the strategy about notifying the next of kin, or I heard about strategies of putting your social security number in ink on your arm so your body can be identified and stuff like that. Now, those strategies might be effective, but there is a differing research on that it also instills fear possibly in those that cannot evacuate. So you're looking at vulnerable populations and you tell somebody that has a person on the oxygen tank, or they have issues with mobility, and you tell them about the next of kin, and that can tremendously increase their anxiety. So those decisions and about those strategies also have to be made very judiciously. Question 3, what type of evacuation behavior should police officers expect, be aware of, and how they need to adapt their modes of policing? That was a very good discussion as well. You broke it down into the different phases. So the alarm phase, so we would call it the pre-planning or pre-positioning or getting ready for an emergency. The acute phase, crisis phase, So that goes to the response. And then the recovery phase, which requires more of that community policing. And you had a really nice discussion here about how you would not, that community that was traumatized, you know, obviously there's going to be some issues with people returning to their homes and having control of that. But you have to be cognizant that this is where that community policing comes in, and you're not going to be concerned about whether the cars are, you know, not fit to be on the road, or whether somebody might not have an ID, or there might be some, you know, minor infractions that you're not going to get preoccupied with, that you typically in a blue sky day would be more oriented towards the law and order, versus in the recovery phase, you are more cognizant about developing both support to the community, serving the community, offering services, going more into the community policing role. Really good discussion about the legalistic. So, you know, being very formal, good messaging to the public, good education of the public, the watchman during the response phase, and the servant. Public servant during the recovery phase, when the stress is high. So as far as challenges, Michael had a really good discussion on how frustrated individuals present a challenge, and the police officers certainly can fall into the trap of taking it as a challenge, or, you know, getting provoked by those behaviors. So it takes a lot of you might have mentioned the verbal judo in your session, or de-escalating, or understanding that this is a different type of policing. So when you're talking about policing strategies, you know, those psychological aspects are really critical. And certainly, I think Jesse or Michael were talking about flooded jails, and people started challenging the public order because they knew that the police was busy with something else. So they were taking advantage of the situation, and that good briefing, good police chief or supervisors during briefings for the deployments of officers to work in those environments probably should have some additional instructions, or, you know, priorities set. You know, what are your mission areas at that stage in that community? So you refocus, and even though maybe your objectives are different during a normal day, they will certainly be different in those different phases of emergency management. So I think this whole area of policing in emergencies is really interesting and understudied, certainly, on how your policing strategies changed in those high impact events, particularly in disasters. Michael talked about welfare checks being paramount to, instead of saying, you know, what are you doing here, and profiling people, to being more open and saying, you know, how can I help? So that they're very service rendering aid. Search and rescue, and of course you discussed how response strategies depend on the department, and how well the department is briefing the officers, and how well the leadership recognizes the need of adapting a different style. I really loved the example that Jesse mentioned, where you went to the area, I believe in East Texas, where you were asked by the sheriff to monitor this one area during the night shift that had those increased numbers of 911 calls, and people were very distrusting of your presence. And then you just reached out to bringing additional resources for them, and food and water, and started talking and broke down that hypervigilance and mistrust. And ultimately, you could confirm that there were no frequent 911 calls from that area after that, because you were able to de-escalate the anxiety in the community, or, you know, certain distressed aspects. I love that example, and that's, you know, that's really brilliant. Mandatory evacuations again come with a lot of challenge. Paulette mentioned the ability to train for social skills, and again, Jesse's disaster, and you did have a discussion on how this policing will be different if it is a security event versus safety event. So if it's an active shooter or if it is a terrorist attack, then certainly because of criminal aspect of it and criminal investigations, the styles of policing have to adapt as well. So it is all hazard, but very, very interesting area of research, I believe. You know, if you're thinking about your capstones, to look at on those different type of events and how, what are the best models of policing or best strategies, you know, for different type of hazards and threats. So really good discussion on that. A lot of passes, I think, and Jesse might have mentioned that, you know, there was a very good topic for reflection, because typically police officers, when they're in those situations, they are action oriented, they are reactive. So thinking beforehand about those changing environments is really important, and training for emotional intelligence and for being responsive to community needs. Disaster subcultures. So you discussed the multi-agency warning systems, mutual aids. Paulette mentioned the subcultures in areas of particular hazards, where those hazards are chronic, like Tornado Alley, and how people develop certain coping mechanisms. They have experience with certain events, and they create some type of resiliency that is very characteristic of that group of people in that geographical area. And I have to tell you about Brownsville. I did some training in Brownsville several years ago in Incident Command System for UT Brownsville. And it was really amazing how a certain subculture developed in Brownsville with their own language and with their own adaptations to the increased presence of, you know, what they called war. And the people at the University of Texas in Brownsville were talking about, you know, we used to go to Matamoros and we used to cross for lunch, and people were just going back and forth, and now we don't do that, because, you know, before the war we used to do that, and now we don't do that. And there was a lot of it nomenclature, you know, before the war, you know, certainly you know, we don't look at the situation in Brownsville as a war zone, but there is this subculture of people that were saying, you know, we used to, people in Matamoros, even they're locking their doors at 5 p.m. It's really difficult. We don't even travel to Big Bend National Park because there are checkpoints by ICE and border patrol along the way, and it just creates an anxiety. So before the war, I loved to do the hiking, but now I don't do that. So this is a different type of threat. It's more of that chronic, prolonged state of crisis, maybe not as acute, and you can't see that response phase, but certainly a certain subculture evolves around that, and people adapt and have a certain language about things and take certain measures that change their lifestyle around that event. So I think it was Paulette that was talking about Corpus Christi as well. So, you know, different areas might develop different subcultures because of the hazard of threat. Then you discussed the different types of decisions that people make in evacuations, and you discerned between the invitation and default and compromise and decision. And you had a really good discussion on the issue of evacuations by default, and those being, you know, really interesting, because people just get stuck in a situation where they might not be able to return, and then they are, you know, they are basically evacuated against their own will, but there's not really a whole lot that they can do. And certainly the most massive, the most effective, the most social, and the one that people the most heed is the evacuation by invitation. And you talked about a lot of different strategies, how family members reach out to people that live in those zones, and people tend to heed those evacuations the most. When somebody contacts them and offers them a place to stay, it's more of a security blanket, it's familiarity, it's lessens the anxiety. So while the mandatory evacuations create high anxieties, the evacuations by invitation, which means by social influence, which you discussed, are a lot more effective and should be encouraged. Certainly not everybody has those resources, but families get together, they link, they develop those social networks, and they seek reinforcements of what their friends are doing, what their neighbors are doing, and if a family member is insisting or encouraging, then they're more likely to leave because that anxiety is not as high. And besides, all the issues with pets typically go with it as well. So if somebody invites you to stay, you've got a room for your pet, hopefully, or you have time to think about some alternative ways for your pets. By compromise, of course, where one person wants to evacuate and the other doesn't or cannot, because they are themselves emergency responders, because they're activated, because for whatever reasons they cannot do it, and then the other person compromises to stay or to go, and by decision, which is certainly typical of people that have more resources, that are better educated about risk assessments, that they can assess more nuance about their particular position over home. Are we truly in a flood area? What do we have as far as finances? Can we afford to stay in a hotel? Those decisions are made more rationally, and they are pros and cons, and they tend to be, again, more risk assessment driven. So they're not as emotional, they are more fact-based. Certainly not always work. And you mentioned this one camping example that was really said. And then you talked about, friends and relatives are better than shelters, even though there is there's also faiths and churches and community groups have a big role in the invitation and by invitation evacuation, because if they are in close proximity, if they're known and familiar, then you're more likely to go to a church, maybe to which you go where you pray, versus a institutional shelter that, again, they don't have the best reputation, and a lot of times, again, it's an increased anxiety factor, and that might be too far away anyway for access. You looked at also at risk perception and how people make decisions about evacuations based on proximity of the event, the certainty that it's going to happen, and some good discussion on social influence, group behavior, exchange of information, and a really, really important discussion on social networks. And there is a theory of social capital. The stronger a social capital in a community, the more effective and resilient that community is. And the social capital has 3 prongs. And that's research by Aldrich, where people in a community rely on bonding, bridging, and linking. Bonding is basically your family members, your neighbors, who you know. So the social capital starts with bonding. If you have friends and neighbors and you have connections with them, then you are a little bit better informed, and you can do better informed decisions about, for example, evacuations. But that's a basic level of social capital. That's just within your proximity. The higher level of social capital in the community is bridging to where diverse groups of people, let's say minorities, linguistic groups that maybe don't speak English, are connected more in some way, maybe through the civic club or through Chamber of Commerce or through any other organization, because they attend local emergency planning committee group. So because they have some kind of organizations that bind them together, that bridge them. And so that is a higher level of social capital. That's where you're going to have more of that knock on the door to some people you identify as vulnerable in your community. You know that there is this group of elderly that live at some brink of your community, or somebody is there that cannot get out of bed, for example, because of some health issues. So again, there is more effective adaptive strategies for crisis if there is this bridging in a community. And the last and the most critical piece of social capital is the linking. And the linking is when you have access to expert knowledge. So you have access to elected public officials, to grants, to organizations, to emergency responders, to non-governmental organizations. And the stronger presence in a community of people with that expertise that can bring those external resources to the community, they're stronger with social capital and social influence. So when you're looking at the most basic level, you've got bonding. People are not isolated. People have families and friends, bottom line. That's a good thing. Then you look at bridging. Different groups of people in a community know of one another, and they can remedy some issues that might exist. And then the highest level is that linking to external resources, having those gatekeepers, having known leaders in a community that are going to be very active in bringing those resources. And that's where that social capital is the strongest. And that's where the communities deal the best with trust, with heeding evacuations. Instead of, mandatory, you have that very, very strong social capital that's going to do the invitation, that's going to help in the decision-making of families about evacuating. That might have an ad hoc meeting, at the town hall level or stuff like that. And I'm not talking about emergency operations centers. I'm talking about the community. That first 72 hours after the disaster strike, what's in that community, how strong is it? And unfortunately, as we look at communities today, they're very fragmented because we travel a lot to work, because we have our communities at work, because we have virtual communities, and those are becoming really, really important too, as that linking the social capital. So, your Facebooks, your Twitters, your, access to that is knowing, having that external access to resources. So there was a really good discussion on that. Let's see, what do I have on that? For some reason, sorry about that. You also talked about vertical evacuations, and on the vertical evacuations, you had some good discussion on vertical down during a tornadoes. I thought that was really good. And one thing to mention about vertical evacuations, they usually deal with institutions, so hospitals, prisons, jails, and Harris County Jail during Harvey was considering vertical evacuation because they could not do full scope evacuation. They were, I actually discussed that in depth with the deputy sheriff of the assistant sheriff Deborah Schmidt during Harris County in Harvey. And she said that they had really, really difficult decisions to think about, you know, who they're going to move where between their medical units, between their most serious offenders who are on lower floors, and whether they're going to leave him or, you know, whether they're going to save medical capacity. And those would be, fortunately, they didn't have to make those decisions. But vertical evacuations, you know, with hospitals, obviously, it's very difficult to evacuate a hospital. In Harvey, there was one hospital that did vertical evacuation because the evacuations outside were just really not feasible. They were, you know, the island in a storm, and, you know, they were flooded all around. So certainly vertical evacuations not as much in the residential areas, because obviously, you know, that was an issue in Katrina, but in businesses that have critical infrastructure that supports that. Something to have in mind, that it might be a lot more practical. At some point in your group, the Jackson Confidential showed up. So, you know, I didn't see Jackson in the session, although he had a few comments here and there because he is stalking the session. But Jackson took the question on different levels of activation based on example in Louisiana and how that preparedness progresses. Based on, you know, times and warnings and so on and so forth. And that brings me to something that I have learned with the strategies for, you know, preparedness, is that article that you looked at, you discussed it was dated, was from 2005. And Jackson mentioned that, you know, hopefully those strategies are in place, like tracking, predictive modeling, interstate connectivity, engineering, counterflows, building the weather expertise into transportation systems, assessment and stuff like that. And I think you would be surprised that even in recent disasters, those things are still needing a whole lot of improvement. But I agree, this certainly was a dated article, so I learned something. I've got to look at some newest research on that to incorporate it into the course. You mentioned also, I think it was in Jackson's session, about the Department of Transportation role, clearing highways, and the Department of Transportation working with DPS and in College Station, Texas A&M canceled school, and Galveston shipped people over to Texas A&M. So Texas A&M Galveston had evacuations pre-planned for, you know, the College Station area. So that has to do with transportations. I mentioned the Brownsville area has an evacuation plan. The University of Texas in Brownsville, where they're going to go towards Austin. And the issue they are having with their plan, it's very interesting. It's an issue of their undocumented students. Their undocumented students are a big problem, not a problem, but in their emergency planning, because they're checkpoints, certainly out of Brownsville. And if they are immigration checkpoints, then what do you do with those students that are undocumented in your university in UT Brownsville? I don't know how they have resolved that, but certainly you would hope that even at the federal level, that watchman style of policing or service style of policing would kick in, and those checkpoints would not center on pulling out people that were undocumented in a disaster area. But this is a totally unexplored field of research, is immigration, illegal immigration in disasters. Because as much as you have vulnerable populations in disasters already, the group of people that are undocumented are much less likely to go or trust authorities, to make themselves visible, to go to shelters, and they're going to be the ones that are the most vulnerable, because typically, if there are newcomers, they don't have logistical base, they don't have a very strong social base or network or that social capital. And that certainly, how do you change in prices to account for those populations, and particularly, in today's climate, it's a very interesting area to think about, whether it is for federal law enforcement. Local law enforcement does not enforce immigration laws unless, you're thinking about Arizona. But certainly with federal checkpoints, what kind of strategies or what kind of adjustments have to be made for the crisis phase or recovery phase, for being in sync with those people that might have double the amount of fear to get on the roads, to be visible, to check into shelters. And so that's a really, really, that's a thing that I think about. Then you talked about pets and had a really, Paulette mentioned the 2006 Pet Evacuation Act and Transportation Act. You discussed the issues of large animals such as horses, exotic animals, lizards, and things like that, and organizations that are charged with providing fostering services or taking care of those. I remember after Katrina Rita combo in Walker County decided that they need to have an animal sheltering plan, and they sort of did this staggered plan to where for large farm animals, for smaller pets, and they did the fostering plan. So families that would be willing to come into the shelter, because a Red Cross shelter in Huntsville did not allow pets. And so people want to evacuate, or that it's very difficult to let your pet go if it's your family member. So those foster families were identified, and they would come and pick up those pets and offer food, or if there were any special needs, they would take care of those, and then give them back to the owners when they were checking out of shelter. So those are really good strategies. As far as other wildlife, you talked about how the wildlife can take care of themselves, but there's also issues in floods. There's issues of snakes, of rabies, and things like that. And it was very traumatic for first responders in Katrina to have to shoot dogs that were roaming, that were aggressive, that were extremely traumatized, hungry, isolated from the owners, and of course, you as precaution for first responders, they could not take risks of having those, and for the public returning. So those are really difficult decisions to make with those animals. And certainly it helps that you cannot leave your animal chained to the doghouse, in disaster, but, those things will still happen. I recall a case of a lion. You're thinking about zoos as well, and evacuation of zoos and stuff like that. There is a lion in Galveston locked up in a church during Ike. There's a big sign on the church: please do not open the door. Because the owner, I think, secured the lion in the abandoned church. So you're going to have those issues as well. And I think animal care in disasters research has been improving. Jackson, Texas A&M is doing a lot of studies on that. Certainly a big issue to consider in emergency management planning for those alternative ways of providing for pets. One of you mentioned those carriers where you get your pets used to them in case of an emergency, collapsible carriers, so they're not as stressed. But certainly horses stress. Horses already stress during a critical event by nature, and so you have livestock, and you might have large amounts of livestock that you have to euthanize and dispose of, which is also a big issue. So overall, I really enjoyed your session. Again, as I said, it was very in depth. You covered a lot of ground. You had a very good generative thinking on the issues. You linked them to practice and to specific examples. And I really loved it. And I commend you on the level of preparedness. And I'll see you on the next one.